Hello, this is Professor James Cement. Welcome to History 2202. This is Lecture 2 or 3, depending on whether you are listening from Section 10 or Section 20. This is on the baby boom in the 1960s. So the discussion question to think about for today is we're going to go back to the 1950s a little bit and take a look at who were the beatniks. What was that term mean? Who did they refer to? And how did 1950s America react to them? How did the 1950s invent, and I put that in quotes, the teenager, and how are teenagers viewed by 1950s America? We're also going to take a look at who was Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock. I don't mean, of course, the character on Star Trek, but the pediatrician and child care expert. And why was he blamed for the juvenile delinquency of the 1950s and the youthful rebelliousness in the 1960s? We're taking a look at what was the role of the civil rights movement sparking the rebelliousness of the 1960s? What was the free speech movement at Berkeley all about, UC Berkeley? And why was it so important in ushering in that rebelliousness of the 1960s? What role did the Vietnam War play in the 1960s rebellion? What was the cultural rebellion of the 1960s all about? And what was the legacy, both political and cultural, of the 1960s? Now, you read a brief bit about the beatniks in the textbook. The beatniks were kind of a countercultural group, a small group of people. They were called the beatniks because of based on the word beat, as in musical beat. And the nick part came from sort of a reference to Russian words where they added nick on to mean people of. So it's kind of like people of the beat. And these were not necessarily political rebels, but cultural ones that arose in the 1950s. They avoided the comfortable life in the suburbs, the institutional job that American mainstream culture was telling them they should take and they should absorb and appreciate, but instead they kind of took off onto this countercultural lifestyle. Instead, they flocked to urban areas rather than the suburbs. In particular urban areas, particular neighborhoods in urban areas. Even as those were seeing a mass exodus to the suburbs, they turned to these sort of bohemian inner city urban neighborhoods, particularly in places like New York City's East Village, San Francisco's North Beach, or the Venice neighborhood here in Los Angeles, and along with many other urban areas around the United States. They saw themselves as kind of an alternative They viewed themselves as they didn't want to participate in that sort of conformist, big institutional life that we talked about that dominated American culture in the 1950s. And the greatest expression of the beatnik idea, beatnik ideals, was put forth by probably the leading poet. And there are many poets from the beatnik movement. This was a poet named Allen Ginsberg. And in 1955, he wrote his most famous poem called Howl. And then he talks about, he begins, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of the night. He's talking about sort of a hallucinogenic, drug-induced alternative to contemporary, to the sort of conformist culture, and he's talking about also how people like him, people who sought an alternative way of life, many of them young people who do not want to participate in the conformist culture of America, were in a sense driven mad by the conformism and the institutional life of the 1950s, and he conveys this, of course, in these kind of hallucinogenic, surreal terms. And this poem Howl became kind of the anthem, poetic anthem of the beatnik movement. Now, for the most part, Americans kind of ridiculed the beatniks, as you can see in these cartoons, portraying them as kind of crazy, out of touch with normal mainstream American culture. On the left, this is, of course, the famous Nancy cartoons. I'm bored, I think I'll become a beatnik. Kind of ridicule anybody who diverted from the mainstream American way of life. And, of course, on the right-hand side, it shows these beatnik guys looking at a beatnik girl with all kinds of infatuation in their eyes and whistling at her, while this conventionally pretty girl who's serving them is completely ignored. But while the beatniks were kind of ridiculed by mainstream American culture, there was a more concerning threat for many Americans. That was their own teenage children. The 1950s was the era of the teenager for the first time, in the sense that the leisure time that young people were now experiencing, because many of them were attending high school and going on to college, they weren't going immediately to work, that it created this kind of new sense, this new generation, this new special generation, this new period in the sort of age progression of life. Now, obviously, people aged 13 to 19 have always existed in human society, but that this was but the idea that teenagerhood, the teenage years were a special, unique time, was something newly recognized in the 1950s. As I said, made possible by the prosperity of the decade that allowed them to stay in school and to kind of have this leisure time before they became full adults. And the spread of mass education, again, allowing them to have this special time before they went to work and became adults. But with this creation of this teenage culture, there was also a certain anxiety connected to this newly defined age cohort. There was increasing concern about teenagers as becoming too indulged by their parents, and that they were sort of kind of this lost generation. And to understand what this means, we need to go back a little bit in time. And we need to focus on this man and what he had to say. So in 1946, a pediatrician named Dr. Benjamin Spock, he had been trained at leading institutions as he went through medical school to become a pediatrician, Yale and University, and then Columbia University Medical School. And there he read all of the existing literature, not just on the physical needs of babies and children, the medicine, but also on the proper raising of children. Pediatricians, of course, are called upon to give advice in a way other doctors are not. Parents go to them to seek advice on how to raise their children, and not just how to, when the children are sick or need health care. And what he found in the existing literature on child care, and his thinking on the subject, it all began to sort of concern him. The traditional ways of baby care advice and child care advice being offered by the experts. What he found was that it was all about science and discipline. Children, it was said, needed to be reared in an atmosphere in which they were to be prepared for the rigors of life, not to be indulged, not to be coddled, but to be toughened up. There was a great deal of emphasis as well on germs and hygiene and preventing children from becoming infected with germs. So it was believed that parents should not hug or kiss their children too much. Moreover, that physical contact was to be kept to a minimum, in the sense that it was a kind of an indulgence that it was best to avoid with children, otherwise one would spoil them. And Spock studying all of this, felt that all of this was wrong. As he says here, the surest way to raise, and so in 1946 he published this book called Baby and Child Care, and it became an enormously popular book. Millions upon millions of parents bought this book. I'm sure if you ask your, probably in my case, my parents, but if you ask your grandparents, many of them probably turned to this book for advice. It was the leading baby and child care book, and has been since the late 1940s when he published it. And here's a quote from it: "The surest way to raise mentally healthy children is to cultivate loving, nurturing, and mutually respectful relationship with them. Loving means, first of all, accepting your child as a person. Every child has strengths and weaknesses, gifts and challenges. Loving means adjusting your expectations to fit your child, not trying to adjust your child to fit your expectations." And so what he was basically teaching in this book was that children were to be given as much love and encouragement as possible. He also told parents to relax about parenting, that, to go with their instincts. If their baby was crying and they felt like it needed some hugging and physical contact, to give that. There was no right or wrong way to raise your children. So he helped. That was one of the reasons why the book was so popular. It allowed parents to relax and just kind of go with the flow and do what seemed right to them, rather than being, forced to fit into a box that child experts were telling them about. Spock emphasized that they should indulge their children's creativity. He also emphasized that they should be physically embraced. And so you had this generation raised to be very self-focused, with what critics said was a sense of entitlement, sense that they were special and to be catered to. It's funny because today us baby boomers say this about you millennials, but of course it was first, this criticism was first directed at baby boomers, that Spock's approach to child rearing and child care that was so widely adopted by so many parents who raised children in the baby boom era was seen as creating this indulgent generation, this spoiled generation, this self-focused, me-focused generation. So as they became teenagers, there was the sense that many of them were overindulged and did expect the whole world to cater to them. And of course, corporate America was very happy to indulge, because many of these teenagers had disposable income from their indulgent parents or from their part-time jobs. And so you begin to see, for example, whole industries catering to teenage fashions, teenage music, teenage tastes in fast food and that sort of thing. And corporate America was quite happy to go along with this. But many parents felt, and many social critics felt, that this indulgence of teenagers was producing a generation of teenagers that were indulged too much, and this kind of bred anxiety among adults that something was going wrong with America's teenagers in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that there were a bunch of alienated teens getting themselves into trouble. There was a great deal of fear around this idea of juvenile delinquency. Of course, today we have these same worries. It's sort of eternal. There's always been concerns about young people by their elders. Today the greatest worry is screen time, of course, but believe it or not, then, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, one of the big concerns was comic books. Children, parents thought this was a terrible waste of time, that these comic books were violent and sexually oriented and idiotic brain-eating reading. And in fact, this is when you saw the comic book codes put into place to regulate the content of these books. But moreover, this fear of the juvenile delinquency of teenagers getting in trouble with the law and was very much in the nation's cultural viewpoint in the late 1950s and 1960s. It can be seen in a number of movies, like The Wild Ones or Blackboard Jungle. Again, as with the beatniks, the fear was not that teenagers were engaging in political rebellion, but that there was a general social breakdown caused by, this indulgent parenthood that had happened. The classic film that caught this was, of course, The Wild Ones, seen up on the top left, where a teenage motorcycle gang, raids this small town and sort of terrorizes this small town. One of the women in the town sort of says to Johnny, he's the leader of the gang of motorcyclists known as the Wild Ones, says, "Hey Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" And Johnny said, "What do you got?" Sort of this directionless, apolitical rebelliousness and juvenile delinquency that created so much fear among adult Americans in the late 1950s and 1960s. And of course, another classic version of this, cinematic version of this anxiety was the film seen on the right here, the classic Rebel Without a Cause. The very name indicates sort of what the message of the movie is about, that you have these rebels against adult culture, against the dominant conformist culture, but they're not rebelling for anything in particular. They don't know what they really want. They're just alienated and directionless, and this created a sort of sense that America's future, because the children are the future, the teenagers were going to be the future leaders of America, was lost. And all of this, of course, a lot of this was blamed on that indulgent parenting that Dr. Spock had promoted in his book. But in many ways, parents and older Americans need not have worried, at least about the apolitical or non-political nature of teenage rebelliousness, because by the early 1960s, this attitude about a rebellious but essentially non-political youth was changing, because American youth were changing, that there was an increasing political dimension to the rebelliousness of youth, and there were a variety of causes behind this. But the most important initial cause was the civil rights movement. Now, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement next week in great detail, so now I just want to mention it for its impact on the baby boom generation, that is, the white baby boom generation, as well as for many young African Americans living in the North. As will become clear, to understand all of the social movements of the last third of the 20th century, what we associate with the 1960s, things like the women's movement, the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, and even things as far afield as it would seem as the environmental movement. All of these in some ways are the offspring of the civil rights movement. It is the granddaddy of social movements in America. Amidst the complacency and self-satisfaction of the early 1950s America, it was a drumbeat that said things are not perfect and ideal here, that there is need for protest, there is need for change. So briefly, to go into the civil rights movement, and again, we'll talk about it much more next week. The civil rights movement, which was the sort of direct and mass popular challenge to the segregated South that began in the mid-1950s, grew out of a couple of things. It grew out of the black church. Martin Luther King, of course, was a reverend, and other major leaders of the early civil rights movements were from the African American church. And it also grew out of older civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we see the early protest movements of the civil rights movement, things like the Montgomery bus boycott. There are the legal challenges in Brown versus Board of Education, which led to the Supreme Court ruling that segregated schools are not constitutional. And these are iconic events of the civil rights movement. And again, we will discuss these in more detail later. But the movement was largely led, this early movement was largely led by older Americans, church officials, traditional civil rights leaders, though many of these people were in fact quite young, but they weren't exactly, teenagers or college students. Martin Luther King, for example, was all of 27 when he initiated the famous Montgomery bus boycott, and was only 34 when he gave his famous speech in Washington, D.C., I Have a Dream, in August of 1963. But by the end of the 1950s and going into the early 1960s, increasing numbers of young people were getting involved in the civil rights movement. Indeed, the civil rights movement was an inspiration for many young people across the North, both black and white. And many of them headed south. They would join local black youths in the South, traveling south to integrate lunch counters, buses, and to pursue voter registration drives, sometimes at great risk to themselves. A number of them were murdered by racist whites in the South. And again, we'll go into this greater detail next week. But what I want to bring up here is that the civil rights movement for these idealistic young people was everything that the 1950s was not. It was not about private fulfillment. It was a public crusade to change America. It was not about accepting America as already perfected and great, and wonderful, but examining its biggest flaw of all, racism. It was not about conformism, but about challenging the conformist political order of the day, which, of course, backed up segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans, particularly in the South. But alongside the civil rights movement was also a growing sense of discontent with American society more generally, a kind of rebellion against the conformity and bigness of American society, all those big institutions we talked about last time, and this idea that politics was always to be geared towards the moderate center, finding compromise and moving towards that center, finding a way to create a consensus-based politics, avoiding the far right conservatism, far left radicalism. It was all about consensus and compromise. Many young people began to sort of challenge that idea and began to say we need a politics of commitment, a politics of protest, because this sort of conformist America was stifling people's potential, that it was forcing them to conform to big institutions, and that America had flaws and problems that needed to be addressed in big public crusades. And so in 1960, you see the formation of one of the leading organizations, youthful organizations of the 1960s, the Students for Democratic Society, usually abbreviated as SDS, founded at the University of Michigan in 1960. This is a picture of them sort of taking a group photograph after creating what was called the Port Huron statement, which was their statement of purpose that they issued upon forming the society. It was basically to challenge sort of the conformist 1960s, to talk about public crusades, talking about social activism, to try to make America a better place, both on the racial front, but also on things about capitalism and conformism and all these sorts of things that they were rebelling against 1950s life. Later, the SDS would grow increasingly radicalized in opposition to the Vietnam War and in opposition to FBI and police crackdowns on protests that occurred as the protest movement against the Vietnam War gained steam in the late 1960s. And in fact, some members of the SDS would eventually become even more radicalized, would leave the movement, and would form the Weather Underground, which saw American society as so flawed and racist and even genocidal, as in the case of the Vietnam War, that it needed to be violently overthrown, and they engaged in political violence, like the bombing of, for example, university laboratories where military research was being done. But that's to get ahead of the game. We need to sort of focus back on what was happening in the early 1960s. And to do that, we need to sort of head north, and in order to capture the changing attitudes of young people in America in the early 1960s, a better place is to go north in California to the flagship of California's university system, UC Berkeley. And of course, California's university system was the prime exemplar of this mass education, this big education that we were talking about last time. No place had a larger and more sort of gigantic university system than California in the early 1960s. In fact, it was the pride of California that had created this mass education system that was the largest and considered the best in the United States. Berkeley was, in fact, the classic mass public education system institution of the post-war era, a vast university aimed at producing the leaders of tomorrow. As we noted last time, another huge institution of the post-war era was the university system. With the GI Bill and lots of government investment, the public university system had grown quite large, particularly here in California. And it had sort of, in a certain way, to many of its critics, like the students that we're going to talk about in a moment, it felt that it had kind of turned itself into a factory, a machine for turning out qualified graduates who could fill the slots of all the other big institutions, big government, big military with the ROTC programs, and most importantly, big corporations. The chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, the man who sort of argued that the university should be kind of like, as he calls it, a knowledge factory in a sense. Note how in this quote, how he sees education. He says the university is being called upon to educate previous unimagined numbers of students. This is the vast expansion, of course, of the public university system. Characteristic of this transformation is the growth of the knowledge industry, which is coming to permeate government and business and to draw into it more and more people raised to higher and higher levels of skill. The production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge is said to account for 29% of gross national product, and knowledge production is growing at about twice the rate of the rest of the economy. What the railroads did for the second half of the last century and the automobiles for the first half of the century may be done for the second half of the century by the knowledge industry. So what he's kind of saying is he sort of envisions education as this factory process, this soulless factory process, not education in the sense of expanding minds and introducing people to culture and humanities and all kinds of thought that might be critical of American society, allowing people to think for themselves and to be critical thinkers. But instead, it's really it's more of a factory for producing productive members of society. In come the raw materials, the students, and out come cogs in the bureaucratic machine. That is sort of how Clark Kerr and the California Public University system saw its job. Again, not as sort of expanding minds and creating critical thinking, but turning raw materials, young people, into productive members of this vast bureaucratic machine to run America. The problem is young people are not, raw materials in the sense that iron or coal is. They have minds of their own. And what happened in 1964, there was a controversy at Berkeley, where students, many of them having participated in the civil rights movement or have been affected by it at a distance, who had been studying it and following it, wanted to discuss politics. They wanted to address some of the main issues of the day. They wanted to allow, and they started to speak out on campus, on public forums, to try to discuss the political issues of the day. But the university basically said, no, we're not going to allow political speech on campus. If you want to speak out on issues of the day, you need to go off campus. That the university is there to educate young people in this sort of conformist model of things. Political talk, political speech on campus, they said, would disrupt this, factory-like, this knowledge industry model of education. And, students came to campus to learn and to do what the institution thought was best for them. And that was to turn them into productive members of society. But as I said, a number of Berkeley students wanted to speak out about pressing issues like civil rights, like the beginning of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which was starting up in the early 1960s. And so they started doing so in what was called the free speech movement. And in response to this, when they refused to stand down, the university basically went the last measure and called in the police to break up these free speech forums. The leader of the free speech movement was a student named Mario Savio. He was a student activist at Berkeley. And here he is, of course, speaking atop a police car. The police had come on campus. The students had surrounded it. And ultimately, you can see the two policemen in the car right there. And he basically stood up on the roof of the police car. Somebody put up a microphone and a portable loudspeaker so he could speak to the crowds that had amassed in Sproul Plaza, the main quad at Berkeley. And he made this very famous speech about that he was not going to participate in this knowledge factory anymore. And he spoke. There's a time when the operation of the machine, and he meant by that the modern American university, but just sort of the general American conformist big institution machine, becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus. So he's kind of talking about the university in the way that Clark Kerr is, but he's doing it in a very critical way, that this knowledge factory has got to be stopped, that you've got to make it stop, and you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. He's arguing not just for free speech, but for free thinking, free minds, that the university should not just be this place where students are turned in, the sort of raw material of students are turned into productive members of society to fit in to the great bureaucracies that dominated American life, but that they needed to have their own freedom. And what's sort of interesting about this movement, and of course the free speech movement sort of launches the great protest movements of the 1960s. And what's kind of fascinating about this is sort of the 1960s revolution, the political and as we'll see, the cultural revolution of the 1960s. It's kind of unique in American history, because usually in American history, and for that matter in world history, great revolutions are caused and are led by people who are in sort of suffering, or people who are deprived of livelihood of life, or they're hungry, or they're shelterless or homeless or whatever. Protest movements are oftentimes during times of great want and great insecurity. What's fascinating about the 1960s is you have this mass protest movement, and it's at a time of unprecedented economic prosperity. It's a protest movement that is sort of led by people whose lives are, materially speaking, quite secure, quite well off. And so it's kind of a protest movement that's unique in that it's sort of protesting, in a sense, the society that has been able to satisfy their material wants, but is not able to satisfy sort of their spiritual and intellectual wants. They see it as, yes, it supplies everything we need materially, but is not supplying our souls. And that's a lot of what the 1960s is about, and as well as the political dimension, and that, of course, is the Vietnam War, which we'll get to in a moment. And indeed, within a year of this protest movement, the Vietnam War had really picked up steam. The Vietnam War was growing under John F. Kennedy, the president from 1961 to 1963 until his assassination in November 22nd, 1963. John Kennedy had expanded U.S. participation in the Vietnam War. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago in the Cold War discussions, the Vietnam War was a war in which the United States got involved in order to prevent communist expansion in the divided nation of Vietnam, where North Vietnam was a communist, was run by communists, the South Vietnam was run by anti-communists, and there was a rebel movement, a communist-led rebel movement in the South known as the National Liberation Front, more popularly known as the Viet Cong, which was trying to overthrow the anti-communist government in the South and unite it with the communist North, and the United States got involved in order to stop the spread of communism. And when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, of course, his vice president, a man named Lyndon Johnson, became president. And Lyndon Johnson was a very ambitious politician and a very effective politician. I have here on the right the sort of what was called the Johnson treatment, where he would really kind of put himself in the face of any legislators who would disagree with him and try to pressure them into agreeing with him. He was extremely effective, not just for this kind of physical intimidation, but for his brilliant ability to manipulate the legislative agenda and get what he wanted. And Johnson, who becomes president in 1963 when Kennedy is killed, has a broad public agenda. He's a liberal in the New Deal tradition. And he's got all of these ambitions, and of course he fulfills many of these ambitions, particularly in the realm of civil rights, where he backs Martin Luther King's push for civil rights. He signs the Civil Rights Act, he signs the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all of these major pieces of civil rights legislation that we'll talk about next week. But he also has a bigger agenda. He wants to expand. He wants to basically expand the New Deal. He has this. His agenda is called the Great Society, and he believes that because America is so wealthy and so productive, that it has the opportunity to really solve all of its, to really eliminate poverty in the midst of this plenty. And he wants to put forth this massive agenda. All kinds of anti-poverty programs. The Head Start program, which of course still exists, to give underprivileged children the chance to go to preschool and get a head start in life. He also has this major agenda to expand health care, and in fact achieves this in 1965. It's not quite as ambitious as Truman's, which was to create a national health care program. It's only aimed at those who are 65 or older with Medicare, and for poorer Americans in the form of Medicaid. But he does get it through in 1965. But here's the thing. So Johnson is very fearful that he will fall into the trap that Truman did. When Harry Truman, the last Democratic president, the last sort of New Deal type president in the late 1940s and early 1950s, he had been stymied in his efforts to put forth a liberal agenda, particularly for national health care, because Truman had presided over the United States government, was president, when China had undergone its communist revolution, and people accused Truman of having lost China to communism. Conservatives and Republicans accused him of being soft on communism, and that charge of being soft on communism kind of haunted Democrats. It haunted Kennedy and it haunted Johnson, so that they felt that they could not get their liberal domestic agenda through unless they took a hard line on communism. And this, of course, led Johnson, who himself was, in fact, anti-communist, strong anti-communist, but went ahead and expanded the Vietnam War, even when many experts were telling him it's probably not a good idea to get involved in a land war in Asia. But he felt he didn't have a choice. That if Vietnam would quote unquote fall to the communists, and we lost Vietnam, if he lost Vietnam, he would never get this ambitious public agenda through. So that's kind of the great ironic thing, that many of these young people who ended up protesting Johnson for his involvement in Vietnam, would have been his sympathizers normally, because no president had ever put forth such a ambitious civil rights agenda. Of course, enacting into law the things that the civil rights movement was pushing for. No president since Roosevelt had expanded the social safety net as effectively as Johnson had. Nobody had spoke to issues of poverty quite like Johnson. And so these young people who normally would be sympathetic to Johnson grew increasingly alienated from him because of his policy in the Vietnam War. And one of the leading voices to speak out against the war that sort of began to change the attitude towards the Vietnam War was, of course, Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King. So in 1967, the war was still widely popular in America. Most Americans believed that the government was doing the right thing, that we had a mission to fight communism, that the president was to be respected and his ideas people were supposed to follow in his lead, that it was patriotic to go fight for your country. Although increasing numbers of young people were protesting against it, partly because there was a widespread draft in the 1960s, and many young people were being forced to go into the military. It wasn't a volunteer military in those days. But the Reverend Martin Luther King began to sort of question the war by the mid-1960s. He had achieved much of his initial agenda of overturning segregation laws and disenfranchisement laws by 1967. But he was beginning to recognize that in order to achieve equality in the United States, both poor people and African Americans had to address the questions of poverty. And he increasingly saw the Vietnam War as preventing this kind of social agenda from being successful. Martin Luther King was told many times. He was by this point, 1967. Of course, he was a Nobel Prize winner. He was applauded by much of the Democratic Party in by 1967. And of course, he had been an ally of Johnson's in the push for civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s. And he was told when he said, "I'm going to speak out against the Vietnam War," many of his allies, many of his friends told him, "You really shouldn't do that. That he should stick to civil rights. That going against a president, especially a president like Johnson, who had been so supportive of civil rights and criticizing the war, which was still widely supported, would cost him support among white moderates and liberals." But King had come to the conclusion that the war was bad for Vietnam. It was not only bad for the Vietnamese, but was really bad for America. And he had, in his speech, as I had you read, he says, joking, "This is I'm a reverend, so I have a lot to say." He mentioned that he had 7 reasons for his opposing the Vietnam War. And this is in his famous speech to the Riverside Church of Manhattan in April of 1967, a liberal church in New York City. And this, of course, was a year before his assassination. But when he lists it, he says the very first one he talks about is that what he says is, what he says is that the Vietnam War is starving the American government of the funding that is needed to fight poverty. That America is wasting its money, it's blowing its money in Vietnam to fight an unfair, even genocidal war in Vietnam that we don't really have no right to be in, that we're supporting this dictatorial regime in South Vietnam, that our great war machine is causing untold death and destruction. But what he really wants to focus on, and the very first reason he gives for opposing the Vietnam War, is something that he thinks Lyndon Johnson will understand, because Lyndon Johnson himself is a man who wants to commit more resources to fighting poverty in America and providing more economic opportunity for America's poor. And King says, this war is starving those efforts. And when King turns against the war, it really is a major cultural milestone. And of course, by the late 1960s, the movement against the Civil War is growing broader and broader. It particularly grows in 1968. There is the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launch a massive offensive against American and South Vietnamese forces that exposes basically the Vietnam War that the American military leaders have been telling, and American government leaders have been telling the American people that we were winning this war, and the Tet Offensive, which exposed that it wasn't really true, that we weren't really winning the war. That turned many people against the war. The leading American newsman of the day, Walter Cronkite, who was the anchor of one of the three leading newscasts of the day, and in those days that's where people got the news, on their evening newscast. In 1968, he too turned against the war, saying it's unwinnable. And these protest movements began to spread across the country. They grew larger and larger. They reached kind of a culmination in 1970 when Richard Nixon, who had replaced Johnson in the 1968 election, had expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia, provoking even more protests, which led to, at Kent State University in Ohio, had led the National Guard with this gigantic protest that occurred there. The National Guard fired on student protesters, killing 4. And of course, this famous picture of those shootings. So the Vietnam War movement became quite massive by the late 1960s. And that was the political dimension of the protest movement of the 1960s. Very different from the sort of widespread acceptance of the government and what the government was doing and sort of big institutions of the 1950s. Here you had this massive protest movement, which was questioning everything the government was doing, questioning the very values of America, that America's always on the good side in its struggles abroad, that it was always supporting the right forces in the world. And here were masses of Americans saying, we're on the wrong side in this war. This was a very big change from the 1950s. An equal change was sort of the changing attitude towards American culture in the 1960s, a turning away from the kind of conformism and acceptance of big institutions that we were talking about before. And so in many ways, the sort of protest movements of the 1960s, the rebelliousness of the 1960s was both political, particularly around the issue of the Vietnam War and American foreign policy, but it was also cultural. Increasingly, Americans were questioning the whole idea of, conforming to the cultural norms of big institutions. One of these forms, of course, one of these cohorts of young Americans were so-called hippies, who decided that they didn't want to participate in this conformist lifestyle. In that sense, they were sort of like beatniks, but they were a much more widespread movement. And one of the ways they expressed themselves was by a kind of a return to the land, eschewing or avoiding kind of the traditional nuclear family for these communes where various couples would live together and collectively raise children. They would go live out in nature off the grid, growing their own organic foods, avoiding the kind of commercialization of American life, and trying to find an alternative way of living to the conformist, consumerist oriented lifestyles of mainstream America. And in so doing, these hippies, in this way, and in forming these communes and in other forms that they'll take, as we'll see in a moment, created what was called a counterculture. In other words, a culture that ran counter to the mainstream conformist materialist American culture. They wanted something different. They wanted different kinds of lifestyles, different ways of expressing themselves, more individualistic rather than conformist. And these communes were one way they expressed it. There was also sort of a sexual revolution, a rebellion in the 1960s. The 1950s is sort of, the ideal in the 1960s was that young people would, sort of undergo a traditional courtship. They would date, and then eventually they would get married. And in the 1960s, you had this new attitude towards sexuality, particularly among young women. Part of this was made possible by the introduction of the birth control pill in the 1960s, which, for the first time in human history, gave control over the reproductive cycle to women themselves. They could take this pill and, of course, not get pregnant. And along with the pill, there was just sort of a general changing attitude about sexuality in the 1960s. The idea that it was a natural kind of thing to do, there was nothing shameful in it, and you sort of see this sexual revolution in the 1960s. There's also a rebellion against traditional American religious life, that the old-style traditional Christian churches were seen as inadequate in fulfilling people's spiritual needs. Many people, like the Beatles here, of course they're not Americans, but many Americans followed their lead, adopted Eastern religions, in this case the religious practices of a Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a Hindu religious spiritual leader. Here they are, of course, in India in 1967, with their yogi. Other Americans remained within the Christian fold, but adopted a new form of Christianity, not the traditional churches where you go on Sunday and you're preached to by the minister, but a much more involved Christianity. They wanted to kind of go back to the original Christian communities of the very early years of Christianity, when these Christian communities were, in a sense, the counterculture communities of their day, when people lived in sort of these communal settings and worshiped their underground religion and lived in communal ways and practiced what these people, they called themselves Jesus people sort of made fun of them, called them Jesus freaks, wanted to return to sort of this true spirituality of Christianity. And so it was kind of another form of counterculture religion, a little closer to home than the Eastern religions of Hinduism and Buddhism that caught on, and of course the New Age religions that were entirely sort of these newly invented spiritual quests that people engaged in the 1960s. This was more closer to home in the sense that it was a Christian form of Christianity, but it was a very different form of Christianity than many of their parents were involved in the traditional church. And of course, there was drugs and rock and roll and all that sort of thing. There was this idea that there were alternative ways of engaging with the world, and that psychedelic drugs allowed you to do that, to sort of break away from the conformism and even sort of the accepted reality of life, and find another way of experiencing that reality through the use of psychedelic drugs like LSD. Sort of the guru of this movement was a man named Timothy Leary. Now, he was not a baby boomer, of course. He was of an older generation. He came out of that kind of greatest generation we talked about before. He was a psychologist. He had his doctorate in psychology. He was teaching at Harvard when he first began to experiment with LSD. LSD, of course, was invented during World War II by a Swiss pharmaceutical company. Timothy Leary initially believed that LSD might be a way to treat schizophrenia, but as he experimented with it, including taking it himself, he came to the understanding that it allowed for a new perception, an expanding of the mind. It allowed for people to experience a whole new way of thinking about the world, and something that he thought people should engage in. And so he kind of he started preaching the LSD, that everybody should use LSD, that it was this way to expand the mind and create and experience an alternative reality that would allow people to become more self-fulfilled and that sort of thing. And of course, in doing so, he was immediately canned at Harvard University. They did not want that kind of thing in their midst, so he was fired from Harvard University. And he took that as kind of a liberation, and he began to travel the country, and he became kind of a guru for young people. With his slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out. In other words, take drugs, tune into this expanded way of looking at the universe, this expanded way of experiencing reality, of breaking free of sort of conformist reality that everybody else was part of, that LSD allowed you this, so you should tune into that, and then of course drop out of society. Don't participate in the conformist big institutional way of life. Many people followed his lead. There was also sort of this alternative idea that people could free themselves from traditional forms of social interaction. And so you had all of these kinds of mass get-togethers in various places around the country. And of course, San Francisco was the epicenter of all this in the late 1960s. Of course, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of young people flocked to San Francisco in what was called the Summer of Love to experience a new way of sort of socially interacting, not in the kind of ways that Americans had traditionally done and societies had traditionally done, at work or in school, but in these kind of collective, spontaneous get-togethers where people would take drugs, listen to music, and kind of commune with each other and become sort of connected with each other at a deeper spiritual level. Here, of course, is the famous Be-In San Francisco in the Summer of Love of 1967. and then of course there was the great musical festival at Woodstock in New York State in the summer of 1969. And these events again were this kind of allowing people who didn't fit in wherever they were to kind of amass together and experience a collective sense that they could remake society. They could make society on a more communal basis, a society in which people could become more self-filled and live richer lives than conformist big institutional life in America allowed them to be. And in the end, the 1960s were kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, politically, it's questionable how much was achieved. I mean, the Vietnam War went on, though it was eventually wound down. But the protest movements didn't seem to immediately shut it down as many people hoped it would. In 1968, of course, a Republican named Richard Nixon won the presidency. So that was kind of a political disappointment for many in the counterculture movement, many in the political rebelliousness of the 1960s. Capitalism was not replaced with communes and other ways of living. So in sense of a political agenda and an economic agenda, the 1960s didn't, they didn't really, the protest movements didn't produce that much lasting change. But on the cultural front of the rebellion in the 1960s proved a lasting success. It fueled new attitudes about expressing oneself in all kinds of ways, in new religious ideas, new personal presentations of oneself in clothes and hair. Short hair and conservative clothing were thrown out the window, and long hair and all kinds of colorful and idiosyncratic clothing became the norm. That individualism and difference was to be celebrated, not to be squashed in the interests of conformity. And this rebelliousness, was very infectious, and I think its legacy is still felt today. We no longer feel that we celebrate sort of individualism and expression and diversity and all that kind of thing in our culture today in a way that in the conformist 1950s it was not the case. But even as all of this protest movement was going on, there was a kind of counter revolution. As we've talked about before in this class, whenever you have a revolution, and the 1960s were a kind of revolution, particularly on the cultural front, an overturning of old ways of life, old ways of thinking. There was also kind of a counter revolution. There was a growing conservative movement, many of it involving young people as well. The same generation that was involved in places like Woodstock and taking of LSD and tripping and all that kind of thing. There was also a growing sort of conservative backlash to this cultural rebelliousness, and it begins, in the 1960s, in the 1950s actually, and sort of grows in the 1960s. It's kind of in the background because these political rebels and these cultural rebels of the hippie sort, sort of caught America's attention and imagination, and so a lot of this sort of conservative uprising was sort of in the background and not seen. But it would reach its fruition, of course, in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan to the White House, who put a renewed cultural emphasis on, and this renewed conservatism put a new, renewed cultural emphasis on making money and turning away from social crusades. But it never really overturned the cultural changes. People's attitude about sexuality, about individual expression, about individualist ways of presenting themselves in their clothing and their hairstyles, that never went away. That has been a cultural legacy of the 1960s that has lasted through this day. But we'll get to that conservative backlash in a couple of weeks. For now, we need to look backwards. And we need to look backwards at one of the key sparks that set the 1960s rebelliousness going. As I mentioned before, that would be the civil rights movement, the most important social movement of the 20th century, and the subject of next week's classes. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.